Everyone thinks they know how Cleopatra died, bitten by a snake. Most people picture it as something almost romantic. A defeated queen, a lost lover, a woman who chose death over surrender. Poetic. The stuff of legend, but that version leaves something out. Cleopatra wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of what came before dying. She had watched it happen to other queens. She knew exactly what Octavian had arranged for her. When she pressed that asp to her skin, she wasn't picking death over life. She was picking death over what a Roman victory actually meant for conquered queens. And that single choice tells you everything about what really happened on the night Roman legions won. Roman conquest was never only about land. It was about breaking spirits, erasing identities, building examples that would echo for generations. And for queens, for the women who dared to rule, who led armies, who challenged Rome's authority, the Romans built something systematic, something documented, something so brutal that even historians who casually recorded mass crucifixions struggled to put it into words. If you want to see how dark history really gets, drop your city and country in the comments. Because what you're about to hear isn't the version Hollywood shows you. Let me show you what Cleopatra already knew, what she died trying to avoid. We'll start with a queen who never got that choice. Her name was Zenobia, and in 272 AD, she ruled an empire that made Rome nervous. She wasn't just a queen. She was a conqueror in her own right, commanding armies, fluent in multiple languages, riding into battle beside her soldiers. She didn't just hold her kingdom. She expanded it. Egypt fell to her forces. Parts of Asia Minor fell too. Territory that had belonged to Rome for generations suddenly answered to a woman who called herself Augusta, a title reserved for Roman empresses. Rome didn't just hate her. Rome feared her. Because Zenobia proved something dangerous, that Rome could be challenged, that Rome could lose, and worse, that a woman could be the one to do it. But empires don't tolerate that kind of challenge, and Emperor Aurelian was coming. The siege of Palmyra dragged on for months. Zenobia's forces fought hard, but Rome had more soldiers, more supplies, more time. The walls held, then buckled. When the city began to fall, Zenobia understood exactly what happened to queens who lost to Rome. She tried to run, loaded supplies onto a camel, and rode for the Euphrates, hoping to cross into Persian territory where Rome couldn't follow. She almost made it. The river was in sight. Freedom was hours away. Then Roman cavalry appeared on the horizon. They surrounded her, pulled her from the camel, bound her wrists. And that night, in Aurelian's camp, Zenobia learned what a Roman victory truly meant. Her tent wasn't ringed by guards protecting her. It was ringed by soldiers wanting revenge. She could hear them outside, hundreds of voices, drunk, furious, describing in detail what they wanted done to the queen who had killed 70,000 Romans, what they'd do if Aurelian gave the word. Her daughters were in the tent with her, terrified teenagers, hearing the same voices, understanding the same threats. Officers came to Aurelian's tent that night with a question. The queen who murdered Roman soldiers, who stole Roman land, who insulted Rome itself by calling herself Augusta. What should be done with her? And some of those officers had suggestions. Specific ones? They earned this, didn't they? This is the spoils of war. Let the men have one night, just one, she'll be broken enough for the triumph. Aurelian said no, not out of mercy, because he needed her intact. He needed her beauty preserved. He needed the crowds back in the capital to watch her walk in chains, conscious, aware, humiliated but not destroyed. Not yet. That destruction was coming, but it would happen in public. So he posted guards inside her tent, not to protect her, but to protect his investment. And all night long, Zenobia and her daughters listened to soldiers describing exactly what those guards were preventing, what awaited them in Rome, what a Roman victory really meant for queens who dared to resist. Morning came. The voices didn't stop. The preparations began the next day. First, they shaved her head, a standard Roman humiliation for captives. The hair she once wore in elaborate court styles, the hair that marked her as royalty, gone. Then they stripped her of her royal clothing, Persian silk, Egyptian gold, the purple that announced her rank. All of it removed. They dressed her in a slave's tunic, rough cloth already fraying. Then came the chains. Not iron. Gold. Because Rome had a sense of irony. You wanted gold? You conquered for wealth? Here, wear it. 60 pounds of it, so heavy she couldn't lift her arms, so heavy she couldn't walk without help. The weight dragged at her wrists, tore her skin, turned every step into agony. But before they marched her toward Rome, there was one more thing. Her son, the one who had fought beside her, who had believed in her vision of an empire that could stand against Rome. Aurelian had him brought to her tent and executed him right there, in front of her. They wanted her to understand. They wanted her to know exactly what happened to those who raised swords against Rome. They wanted her broken before Rome ever laid eyes on her. Now she was ready. Now she understood. Now the real ordeal could begin. The march to Rome took weeks. Zenobia walked in those golden chains through summer heat, no shade, no water, unless the Romans chose to give it. In every town along the road, crowds gathered. Word had spread. The queen who defied Rome, the woman who thought she could be Augusta. They threw things, rotten food, stones. Worse, they shouted at her, described what they'd do if they could reach her. And Zenobia kept walking, because stopping meant being dragged, and being dragged meant more pain. Her daughters walked behind her, also chained, also struck by stones, also hearing the threats, the specific ones, the ones describing brothels, the promises of what Roman men did to the daughters of defeated queens. Finally, after weeks of this, they reached Rome. The triumphal parade was scheduled, the largest spectacle Rome could produce. Proof of Aurelian's victory. Proof that defying Rome ended in chains. The procession began at dawn. Zenobia stood at the starting point, those golden chains pressing into wounds already worn raw by weeks on the road. She could barely stand. Slaves had to hold the chains so she wouldn't collapse under the weight. The crowd roared. Thousands of Romans packed the streets, waiting for this exact moment. The queen who dared, the woman who thought she could be their equal. Now look at her. The parade moved forward. Zenobia took a step. The chains pulled. She stumbled. The crowd laughed. They threw things, rotten vegetables, waste, stones. One struck her face. Blood ran down her cheek. She kept walking. Every few blocks, the parade stopped. A senator stepped forward, unrolled a scroll, read out her crimes: stolen territory, dead Romans, the arrogance of calling herself Augusta. The crowd drank, shouted, demanded punishment, demanded worse. Soldiers marching alongside the procession stood close enough to touch her, close enough to grab her. And they did. Hands reaching between the guards, groping her, describing exactly what they'd been denied that first night in Aurelian's camp. The guards pushed them back, not to protect Zenobia, but to preserve the spectacle. She needed to make it to the end. She needed to survive this, because Rome wanted to watch her crawl. 5 hours of this. The heat, the weight, the pain, the humiliation, the hands, the voices. Her daughters behind her living through the same thing, hearing the same promises about brothels, about what happens to the pretty daughters of mothers who lose to Rome. And Zenobia walked, because what choice did she have? The parade ended at the Forum. Aurelian gave a speech, the glory of Rome, the price of resistance. He pointed at Zenobia. This is what happens. This is what Rome does to those who defy us. Learn this lesson. Remember this woman. Then came the twist. Aurelian didn't execute her. He gave her a villa in Tivoli, a comfortable life, a pension, guards to protect her. Everything a former queen could want, except freedom. This was Rome's mercy. This was what submission bought you. Fight us, and you'll walk in chains of gold. But survive the walk, and we'll let you live comfortably as our trophy. Proof that resistance ends in surrender. Zenobia lived there for years, in that villa, with those guards. Never allowed to leave. Never allowed to go home. Never allowed to forget she was alive, only because Rome permitted it. Some sources claim Aurelian forced her to marry a Roman senator. Not for love, not by choice. A final humiliation. The queen who once ruled the East now belonged completely to Rome. Even her body. And Rome watched, and Rome learned. This was mercy. This is what happens when you're lucky. When Aurelian likes you, when Rome decides to be generous. Most conquered queens weren't lucky. Most didn't get villas. Most got exactly what Zenobia spent that first night listening to. What those soldiers wanted to do. What a Roman victory actually meant. Vercingetorix's wife. Let me show you the pattern, the system, what Rome did when mercy wasn't on the table. 50 years before Zenobia, there was a man named Vercingetorix, leader of a great Gallic coalition who united the tribes and nearly defeated Julius Caesar. But nearly isn't a victory. Caesar accepted nothing less than total surrender. When Alesia fell, Caesar made his terms clear. Vercingetorix could surrender and spare his people, or watch them all die. Vercingetorix chose surrender. He walked out of that fortress in chains, believing he was saving lives. His wife believed it too. So did his children. They watched him go, trusting Caesar's promise that surrender meant survival. Caesar lied. The moment Vercingetorix was in custody, Caesar's officers moved in, seized the family, and separated them. The wife never saw her husband again. She had no way of knowing he'd spend 6 years in a Roman prison before being strangled during Caesar's triumph. She didn't know, because by then she had already been distributed. That was the actual word used. Distributed like supplies, like equipment. The families of defeated leaders were rewards for officers, payment for service, spoils of war. Vercingetorix's wife became the property of one of Caesar's commanders. Not a domestic servant. A captive concubine, which meant exactly what it sounds like. No choice, no voice, no rights. On that very first night, still wearing the clothes she'd had on when she watched her husband surrender, she belonged to the Roman officer who had conquered her. And their children were sold. Sons became slaves or gladiators. Daughters went to whoever could pay. The family Vercingetorix thought he'd saved by surrendering was destroyed within days. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was policy, standard practice documented in Caesar's own writings. No drama, just the business of empire. The families of defeated leaders were assets, distributed according to law. But here's the thing. Rome didn't only do this after a defeat. Sometimes they did it beforehand, as a warning, as psychological warfare, to show everyone exactly what resisting cost. Boudica, ask Boudica. She was a British queen. Her husband had a deal with Rome, client kingdom status, autonomy in exchange for tribute. Then he died, and Rome decided it wanted more than tribute. It wanted the kingdom outright. Boudica refused. That land was hers, her people's, her daughter's inheritance. Rome had no claim to it. Rome disagreed and sent soldiers to make its disagreement clear. These weren't negotiators. They came to her home, and they didn't come to talk. They whipped Boudica publicly in front of her people, stripped her, beat her, made sure everyone watched, made sure everyone understood. This is what happens when you say no to Rome. But that wasn't the worst part. Her daughters, teenagers, were assaulted by Roman soldiers right there in front of Boudica, in front of her people, in front of everyone who needed to learn what Roman conquest meant. Out in the open, no attempt to hide it. It was theater. It was a message. This is what happens to the daughters of queens who resist. This is what Rome does to people who think they have rights. Tacitus wrote about it specifically, documented it, because it was so extreme that even Romans who had already seen everything found it worth recording. That's how bad it was. Boudica didn't start her rebellion because she wanted to. She started it because Rome had already done the worst thing imaginable. What was left to fear? What could Rome possibly do that was worse than what it had already done? So she burned 3 Roman cities. 70,000 Romans died. Londinium was reduced to ash, and when she learned the final battle had turned against her, she didn't wait to be captured. She took poison, because she had already seen what capture meant. She had lived through what Rome did to queens. She had watched her daughters suffer. Death was mercy compared to a Roman victory. Cleopatra's calculation. And Cleopatra knew all of this. Every story, every fate, every example. She knew about the families of defeated leaders, about the distribution of captives, about what happened to women who fought Rome. And she knew exactly what Octavian had planned for her specifically, because Octavian wasn't subtle. He wanted her for his triumph. He wanted Rome to see the Queen of Egypt in chains, wanted to parade her the way Aurelian paraded Zenobia. But there was more to it. Because Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was, in Roman propaganda, the woman who had seduced Julius Caesar, who had seduced Mark Antony, who had supposedly used her body and her charm to manipulate Roman generals. Or so the story went. Octavian wanted to punish that too. The triumph he'd planned, the one where Cleopatra would walk in chains, wasn't only about Egypt. It was about humiliation, sexual humiliation, exposing the woman who had allegedly undone 2 of Rome's greatest men, possibly stripped, certainly degraded. Rome's revenge for daring to wield sexuality as power. And after the triumph, after the parade ended and the crowds went home, Octavian had further plans. She wouldn't be executed like the male prisoners. She'd be kept, displayed, a permanent trophy, possibly forced into marriage, definitely controlled. Her body, her image, everything about her would belong to Rome. Her children weren't spared from the calculation either. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, would die immediately. Too dangerous, too much of a threat to Octavian's legitimacy. He'd be executed first, and Cleopatra would know, would watch, would understand. Her other children, the twins she had with Antony, would live. But as Romans raised to forget Egypt, forced to deny their mother, their heritage, everything that made them who they were, Cleopatra looks at the asp, coiled in its basket, the bite that will stop her heart, the death that will end the pain before it even starts. She thinks of every queen who faced a Roman victory and learned what it actually meant. Death isn't defeat. Death is defiance. Death is the one victory Rome can't take from her. The one choice they can't make for her. She presses the snake to her skin, feels the bite, the venom, the numbness spreading, and dies free. Dies a queen. Dies Egyptian. Never takes part in Octavian's triumph. Never wears his chains. Never becomes his trophy. Rome doesn't get her body. Doesn't get her image. Doesn't get the spectacle it wanted. All they get is a corpse. And you can't parade a corpse the same way. You can't humiliate the dead. Her choice proves everything. Proves exactly how bad it really was. Because Cleopatra wasn't weak. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't broken. She was strong enough to choose death. And she chose it instantly, without hesitation. That's what a Roman victory truly cost. That's what awaited conquered queens. That was the night they feared most. Arsinoe. But Cleopatra, at least, only heard the story secondhand. She learned from other women's suffering. Some queens never got that privilege. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, took part in Caesar's triumph 30 years before Cleopatra's own death. She was 17, young, beautiful, terrified. Caesar marched her through Roman crowds, screaming insults, throwing things, describing exactly what they wanted to do to her. But Caesar's triumph that year also included other captives, other queens, other noble women from conquered territories. And some of them, the ones who weren't valuable enough, weren't famous enough, weren't worth preserving for political reasons, got exactly what the soldiers wanted. Arsinoe heard the shouting, understood what was happening, understood how lucky she was to be Caesar's prisoner, to be famous, to be Cleopatra's sister. That's what saved her from the same fate. She was exiled to Ephesus, a temple, priestess duties, celibacy, which sounded almost merciful after what she'd witnessed. But the sources say she never spoke again, never smiled again, lived in that temple like a ghost, completely undone by what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd nearly experienced. Years later, Cleopatra had her assassinated. Not out of cruelty, out of strategy. Because Arsinoe had taken part in a Roman triumph, had been paraded, had been broken, which made her useful to Rome. A puppet queen who would do anything to avoid being displayed. Again, Cleopatra learned from that. Learned that even survival could be its own kind of trauma. That even mercy could destroy you. That a Roman victory ruined you, whether you lived or died. Thus Nelda. And some queens went through worse. Thus Nelda was a Germanic noblewoman married to Arminius, the man who wiped out 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. Rome's greatest military disaster, Rome's deepest humiliation. Rome wanted revenge. Rome wanted Arminius. Instead, they captured Thusnelda. She was 7 months pregnant when they took her. And Rome loved that detail because it wasn't only her they had conquered, it was her unborn child, too. The next generation. The bloodline. They marched her pregnant through Rome in chains, crowds screaming that even the baby belonged to Rome now, that nothing escaped, that their victory was total. She gave birth in captivity, chained inside a Roman cell, and they took the baby immediately. Didn't let her hold him. Didn't let her name him. Took him and raised him Roman, trained him as a gladiator, someone to die in the arena for Roman entertainment. Years later, she was forced to watch. Her son, the one she had carried while walking in chains, fighting in the Colosseum, dying there. And she was never allowed to speak to him. Her husband, Arminius, was alive and free, fighting Rome from across the border. And he knew his wife was a prisoner, knew his son was being raised as a gladiator, and could do nothing about it. That's psychological warfare. That's torture. And it's what Rome did systematically, not to one queen, but to hundreds. The Cimbri women, when Rome crushed the Cimbri and Teutones in 101 BC, it captured 60,000 women, 60,000, distributed among the legions. Officers chose first. Soldiers drew lots for the rest. An entire population of women wiped out, divided up, claimed. Many of them chose death instead. Plutarch documented it. Hundreds of women hanging themselves, trying to kill their children first. It was mercy, because they already knew what awaited them. Rome intervened when it could, stopped the suicides, saved the women. Not out of kindness, out of protecting property. These women had value as slaves, as concubines, as warnings. That was the system. That was the policy. That's what Rome did after a victory. Break the men in battle. Break the women afterward. Use both as examples. Make sure everyone everywhere understood. You cannot beat Rome. And losing meant something worse than death. The same system. Every time. Zenobia got a villa because Aurelian needed propaganda. Vercingetorix's wife was distributed because Caesar didn't need any. Boudicca's daughters were assaulted because Rome wanted to terrorize Britain. Cleopatra got to choose her death because she moved fast enough. Arsinoe carried her trauma silently. Thus Nelda had her son stolen. The Cimbri women were erased entirely. Different outcomes, same system, same empire, same message. Resist Rome, and this will be the night you fear. Not the battle, not the siege, Not the defeat, the victory, the Roman victory. When the fighting stops, when the gates close, when the chains come out, and the soldiers remember everything you cost them. That's the night conquered queens feared most. And that fear, that knowledge, that understanding of what waited on the other side. That's why Cleopatra chose the snake. Because death was freedom. Death was mercy. Death was the only victory left to take. And if you understand that, if you understand why the most powerful queen in the ancient world looked at a snake and saw salvation, then you understand what Rome actually was. Not marble and glory, not civilization and law. A machine that turned people into lessons, that turned queens into warnings, that made death look like kindness. And it worked for centuries because everyone knew. Everyone understood. Everyone learned from the examples, the golden chains, the shattered families, the daughters, the stolen sons. There was no winning. And losing always meant this. That's the history they don't tell you. That's the truth behind the marble statues. That's what Roman conquest actually meant. The night conquered queens feared most was the night Rome won. Now you know why.